Hello and welcome to Relatable Code. In this video, we're going to talk about the navigation component in Android. So let's get started. The navigation component is a very neat tool developed by Google as a Jetpack library to help you with navigating between fragments in Android. It handles a lot of stuff like managing the backstack of your fragments, for example, and not having to write those fragment transactions like the ones that we did with the previous video about fragments, which you should watch if you don't know about fragments yet in Android. Okay, so with navigation components, navigating between fragments is a lot easier, and navigating back between fragments is easier as well. That's what we're going to do in this tutorial, and you're also going to see how to pass data between fragments using navigation arguments. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to our app level build.gradle, and we're going to paste these two dependencies, which will allow us to work with the navigation component in Android. After that, click on Sync Now, so that we can now work with these dependencies. Our project is currently syncing, so that we can add the navigation graph, which we will use for our navigation component. Okay, and you will see what a navigation graph is after you go to your resources folder right there. Right-click on that, go to New, Android Resource Directory, and instead of values, choose Navigation. Okay, click on the OK button. More reasons to say the OK word. And inside this navigation folder, we're going to right-click New Navigation Resource File. Okay, click on that and name this file nav_graph. Click on OK again. And now you're going to see that you have something called a graph which can help you manage the navigation between your fragments. And setting up this graph is very easy. All you have to do is click anywhere here, basically. And after that, you can choose the fragments that you want to add to this graph. We're going to choose fragment first as a starting point. And to add another fragment, you can also go to this button and choose fragment second. Okay, if you don't have these fragments created, don't worry. I'll share the whole code of this project in the description of this video. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. So now, as you can see, you can actually visualize the fragments that you have inside this navigation graph, which is very neat. So you have first fragment and you have second fragment. And if you notice, there's a home icon for your first fragment, which indicates that first fragment is indeed the first fragment of this navigation graph, which we call our start destination. Okay, so when you populate this navigation graph in your activities XML, the first fragment that you're going to see is the start destination. In our case, that's the first fragment. Okay, that's the ID, and the start destination takes an ID as a value. Okay, that's pretty much it. That's how you set up your navigation graph XML. And now we want to work with that navigation graph. And to do that, we're going to go to our activity main XML. We already have a fragment container view set up, which is correct. Navigation components also require a fragment container view, but you're going to make some adjustments here. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to use first fragment anymore as a name. So you can delete that, and you have to use these three properties. Okay, you have to give it a name of nav host fragment so that Android can recognize that this is going to be used for a navigation component. You have to set the nav graph to the nav graph that you created here with that same name under the navigation package. Okay, and you have to say that this will be the default nav host for this fragment container view, basically. Okay, and that's pretty much it. That's the only change that you have to make with this fragment container view. And as you can see, we're still seeing first fragment here, because first fragment was the start destination of our graph. If we changed that start destination to be second fragment, like this, if you go back to your activity underscore main, you will see that this UI will get updated and you will see the second fragment by default. Okay, we want to start with our first fragment logically, so change that back to first fragment, and that's all you need to do for your fragment container view. Okay, that's how you change it so that you can now work with a navigation component. And to be able to access that navigation component and work with it in your Kotlin code, you're going to write two lines of code. The first line of code will involve getting your nav host fragment, getting a reference to that fragment in particular, which will be this one, basically. Okay, and to extract a nav controller from that nav host fragment, and you're going to see why we need that controller shortly. So this is currently a fragment container view, but its name is nav host fragment as we specified. But in order to work with it as a nav host fragment, we need to cast it. And to do that, we can do something here like val nav host fragment equals to, we need to get a reference to this fragment container view. So we can use support fragment manager dot find fragment by ID. This will be the first time that you see this function in our playlist. And here you have to pass the ID of your fragment container view, basically. But that's not enough, because currently our nav host fragment is a normal fragment, but we want it to be a nav host fragment. Okay, so that we can now consider it a nav host fragment, which will allow us to create a nav controller. Okay, so here as a global variable, we're going to create that nav controller as a late init var nav controller of type nav controller. It doesn't have a value yet, but we're going to get that value from our nav host fragment with nav controller equals to nav host fragment dot nav controller. Basically, that's how you extract a nav controller from your nav host fragment, and that's why we did this cast to a nav host fragment. If I remove this, you will see that we don't have a nav controller because this is now a normal fragment which doesn't contain a nav controller, unlike the nav host fragment. That's how you set up a nav controller, which you will use to navigate between your fragments. Okay, and here, if you remember, in the previous video, which I will also link in the description, we used a function inside the main activity to handle the navigation between our first fragment and our second fragment. And we said that this was necessary if you want, in our case, or better in our case, because now we have this code decoupled from our fragments. And guess what? That approach will help us now because our first fragment will only call that function from our activity, and the navigation will get handled inside that function. Okay, so we don't have to change anything except this function, basically. So let's comment that out. We don't need a support fragment manager anymore because we can now navigate using our nav controller, and we can do that with navController.navigate, and as a parameter, one option you can use is to pass the ID of your second fragment, which you can get from your nav graph. In our case, it's second fragment. Okay, that's a fragment, and that's the ID of our fragment in our nav graph. So copy that, go back to your main activity, and here you can write r.id.secondFragment. It's that easy. Nothing else to it. And here I think this currently expects some arguments. Let's remove that code so that we don't have a crash. We're not currently sending arguments to second fragment, but we will do so shortly. Okay, so that's basically it. Run your application again. And now we have our application loaded into our emulator. Here you can see our first fragment. If I click on navigate, we will get navigated to our second fragment that easily. In our first fragment, we're calling this method from our activity, which just calls the navigate function of our navController to navigate to second fragment. Okay, and if I press on the back button, I get navigated back to my first fragment without having to handle that with our backstacks, because that's handled by the navigation component by default. And that's one of the many advantages of using the navigation component, as you can see. But that's a very basic setup. Now we're going to see how to send data between fragments and how to customize our back button behavior to pop a different backstack. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to navigate between these fragments using a more modern approach. Okay, so go back to your navigation graph, or a better approach, in my opinion. You can go directly to your design, and as you can see, if you hover over a fragment, you can find a circle right here. And the same thing goes for your second fragment as well. If you drag that circle from the first fragment to the second fragment, you're specifying an action that might happen, which is navigating from the first fragment to the second fragment. And as you can see visually, if you have a lot of fragments, it really gives you a nice vision of what happens between these fragments, which fragment navigates to which fragment, basically, which makes managing all these different fragments, these different screens, a lot easier. Okay, if you go back to your split, you can see that something called an action is now specified. This action is the action that will navigate me from first fragment to second fragment. If you expand your code right there, you can see that this action by default takes an ID of action, the name of the fragment that you're navigating from, followed by the to keyword, followed by the name of the fragment that you're navigating to. Okay, and as a second parameter for that action, there's the destination, which is the ID itself of the fragment that you're navigating to. Okay, that's pretty much it. And now, in your code, you can make use of that action. But first, I think we need to add a new plugin to our build.gradle file. So here, you have to paste this code above your plugins block of code, which will add a new plugin called Safe Args, okay, which will allow us to navigate safely between fragments and pass arguments between them. And inside your app level build.gradle, you have to add a new plugin here as well for that Safe Args. And that plugin is ID Android X Navigation Safe Args Kotlin. Okay. After you add those two blocks of code, click on Sync Now and go back to your main activity. Now, if you check out the navigate function right there, you can delete the ID that we were directly using inside the navigate function, and instead you can write first fragment directions dot action first fragment to second fragment. If you control left click on that, it will navigate you to the action itself. Okay, and by default, since our first fragment had an ID of first fragment, the direction that we were going to use to get access to this action was called first fragment directions because of that naming convention. Okay, that's how you do it. If you run your project again, and here we have our application loaded again. If you click on navigate, it will navigate you to second fragment as well. Okay, so those are two ways that you can use to navigate between fragments. But I'm going to show you now how to use those safe args to pass data to the second fragment. Okay, so let's go back to our folder right there and create a new data class, which we will pass to our second fragment, and this will be called something like second fragment input. Inside second fragment input, we will define something like second fragment text, which will be of type string. And to be able to pass this data class between our fragments, it needs to be either a parseable or a serializable. So let's make this a parseable with Kotlin's parcelize and have it extend parseable. Just like that, we can now pass this data class from our first fragment to our second fragment. But how do we do that? If you go to your nav graph XML, you can click on second fragment. If you don't have these attributes opened, you can click on that, which will allow you to see this window where we're going to see our arguments. After clicking on second fragment, click on the plus icon, which will add an argument. And inside this window, we will now specify our data class, which we added. Where was it again? That was second fragment input, okay, which is this one, that second fragment input. It will be of type custom parseable. If you click on that, you're going to have this pop-up, which will automatically detect that you already have a parseable in your application. That's the one that we need. Double click on that, and we need to give it a name. So here you have to pay attention. Be careful with these argument names, because if it's too long, for some reason, the application crashes, and it's really tricky to debug. Okay, so pay attention to that. Its name is second fragment input, so you can call it something like SF input, just like that. You can have an array of this input, we don't need that, and you can have it be nullable. You can either pass this argument if you have it nullable, or you can choose not to pass it. We want to leave it by default like that. We don't want to give it a default value, which you can also do, I think, with the primitive types, which you can pass, like floats, integers, longs, strings, all of the other primitive types. After you do that, click on Add. So now, second fragment will expect this second fragment input. If you go back to your main activity, you will see that you have an error here now, because you have no value passed for parameter SF input. So go inside these parentheses and write SF input equals to second fragment input, and from here you can basically pass whatever you want. Okay, so you can pass second fragment text equals to text from first. From is written wrong and first is written wrong. From first fragment. Just like that, we were able to pass a data class to our second fragment. So now go to your second fragment so that we can intercept that data class and use it, basically. So as a global variable, one thing you can do is you can write private val. You have to gain access to these arguments. A common naming convention is args, which extends second fragment args. Okay, so do that, second fragment args, and after that you can write by nav args. Okay, remove those brackets, and that's how you can create a reference to the navigation arguments inside your second fragment by using by Nav Args, which is basically a form of delegation, if you want, a new method of creating variables. Okay, so you can gain access to whatever is inside these second fragment args right here inside your on you created. You have a binding setup. So go back and write binding.tv second fragment.text equals to args dot SF input. You now have access to SF input directly dot second fragment text. Okay, if you control left click on second fragment input, you will get navigated to your nav graph, which is very handy. Okay, so that you can see where each component comes from. So let's rerun our application to test out if this data class is indeed getting sent from the main activity. That's our emulator. If I click on navigate, you can see here we have text from FirstFragment. And that's how you send data between fragments using navigation arguments with the navigation component. Okay? Okay, so now that is settled. We're going to create a third fragment so that we can see how the backstack works with the navigation component. Okay, so go back to your main folder, go to right-click, new fragment, blank fragment. We're going to name it, guess what, third fragment. Click on finish. It's going to compile that fragment. We're going to remove most of that fragment in general and remove that companion object as well. Okay, here we're going to create the binding like we normally do, which is fragment third binding. We're going to give it a value inside on create view, like binding equals to fragment third binding dot inflate layout inflator. We're going to return binding dot root. This will no longer be a nullable view, and we're going to have an on view created. I'm not sure if we will use it. I'm just used to declaring that method. Here we're going to have a simple text. Let's convert this to a constraint layout for good practices and call this text a third fragment text. Let's have it centered like that. I think that text size is fine. We're not changing it in our fragments. So now go to your second fragment. We're going to add a button to navigate to our third fragment. So here, this will no longer be a match parent text. We're going to move that to the middle right there. It will be centered because we have this one enabled, this option. And underneath that text view, you can create a new button. So drag that like this. You can create some margin. And let's call this btn underscore navigate. btn navigate already exists, I think, because I'm using that in another activity, which is fine. Just click on continue. And you can also change the text of that button if you want. Let's change that to navigate as well. That got reflected right there. And now inside our onView created, we need to attach an onClick listener to that button like this. And guess what? The action of that onClick listener will not be handled in our second fragment. For good practices, it will be handled inside our main activity. Okay, let's add that to our interface. This is optional if you want. You can skip this step if you don't want to, and you can directly just create a public function inside your main activity. But we're going to go with this approach to create a new method which will force our main activity to implement it. Just like that, inside this method, we can navigate from the second fragment to the third fragment. But don't forget, you have to add that third fragment to your nav graph. So that's it. And create an action from the second fragment to the third fragment so that you can navigate between them using this safe way, basically. And you can copy. I don't think we need that code actually. Let's write navController dot navigate second fragment directions dot action second fragment, third fragment. So we're going to use that function inside our second fragment, just like we did with our first fragment. Let's copy that code, go back to our second fragment. If our activity is main activity as main activity to access the method, and we're going to need on second fragment button clicked. Okay, that's basically it. That should work. Run your application just to make sure. Open your emulator. It's launching, and that's your application. Click on navigate. That's your second fragment. Click on navigate. That's your third fragment. Okay, so the navigation is properly functioning. And if you click on the back button, you get navigated back to the second fragment and then to the first fragment. Now that's the default behavior. Well, what if you want to go back from your third fragment directly to the first fragment by skipping that second fragment? You can do that inside your nav graph right there. If you click on the code, this will for some reason appear as an error, but it's not an error. Android Studio doesn't recognize it. I'm not sure why. But here, as at the level of your action, which is action second fragment to third fragment, you can add another parameter. Let's get the code view, and that's pop-up2. Okay, you can use pop-up2, and here you can write first fragment. Let's see what this does. Run your application. That's our application. It got launched. That's our first fragment. That's our second fragment. That's our third fragment. If I click on back, that's our first fragment. Okay. So by using this pop-up2, I was able to let this action know that if I click on the back button inside my third fragment, something different will happen. And that's the navigation graph popping up back to my first fragment. Okay, that's how you can skip a few fragments if you want to navigate back in that way, which is very common in modern applications. Okay, you will need to do this quite often, especially when you have large flows. And that's pretty much it. Okay, that's how you can customize your back button behavior by using the nav graph. Well, what if I want to click on the back button and navigate outside of the whole application? You can also do that with the pop-up2, but instead of using the ID of your first fragment, you can use the ID of your navigation graph itself. So if you copy the ID of your navigation graph and you paste it here inside your pop-up2 code, and you run your application again, here you have your first fragment, second fragment, third fragment. If I click on back, I will exit the whole application. Okay, that's another application. You don't have to worry about that. Let me show you that again so that you can see how it's clear if you want. That's our first fragment, second fragment, third fragment. If I click on back, the whole application will exit. That's how you can handle the backstack using your navigation component. As you can see, it's very easy to set up and use as well. If you see your navigation graph right here, you can get an idea of what's happening between your screens, which is very essential, especially when you have more than 50 screens in your application. Managing them can be very troublesome, especially if you don't know which screen can navigate to which screen. Okay, so keep that in mind. And here I'm going to give you one additional piece of advice if you want, and that's regarding the navigation. Okay, you have to take note when using this form of navigation between your fragments. If you're not currently inside first fragment and you try to call this code, you will get a crash because you're trying to access first fragment directions from a different fragment. But you can solve this by writing if navController.currentDestination.id equals to r.id.firstFragment, which will make sure that you are currently in your current destination at FirstFragment, so that you can avoid a crash like that. Okay, that's something you have to keep in mind. You have to manage this in your application, and you can do the same for your second fragment here as well. Okay, with r.id.secondFragment, according to the name of the fragment inside your navgraph XML file. Okay, just keep that in mind, and that's pretty much it. Note that you can definitely pass some data like this from the first fragment itself. You don't have to pass it inside the main activity to your second fragment. You can go to your interface right here for your on first fragment clicked. You can create a variable for a text if you want, like first fragment text of type string, which you will have to override inside your main activity right there. So now you can copy that text from here, and when you want to use it inside your first fragment, you can pass that first fragment text right from there. Okay, and note that this is a little neater to do. So this is how you can supply the text from the first fragment. Let's just adjust it a little right here, like text coming from first fragment. And inside that method, we will pass that string directly to our second fragment. Okay, that's all there is to it. So if you run your application again, check your emulator, that's your first fragment, and that's the text coming from first fragment. Okay, that's how you can manage sending data from the first fragment and getting it inside the second fragment. Okay. If you find this content to be relatable, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for future content, and I'll see you in the next video.